June 6, 1944. Before the sun rose over Normandy, before the beaches of Omaha and Utah turned into fields of fire and chaos, 225 men prepared for a mission most commanders considered suicidal. They were the United States Army Rangers of the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions, handpicked for the most dangerous single objective of the entire D-Day invasion. Climb a vertical cliff under enemy fire, seize a fortress that dominated the coastline, and destroy 6 German 155mm guns capable of annihilating the landing forces on Omaha Beach. If they failed, thousands of Americans would die before even touching French soil. The place was called Pointe du Hoc, a narrow, jagged promontory rising nearly 100 feet above the sea. For months, Allied reconnaissance had shown massive gun emplacements positioned there, protected by concrete casemates, anti-aircraft batteries, interlocking trenches, and machine gun nests built into the cliff face itself. German engineers had turned the point into a fortress. If those guns remained operational on June 6th, they would command a firing arc across Omaha and Utah beaches, striking transports, landing craft, and troops struggling ashore. The entire western flank of Operation Overlord depended on silencing them. Colonel James Earl Rudder, a calm but relentless officer from Texas, was selected to lead the assault. When asked if his men could take the cliffs, he famously answered, "We'll do it," without hesitation. But privately, even he understood the stakes. The Rangers had practiced cliff assaults for months in England, training on rope ladders, grapnels, and scaling towers. They learned to climb while carrying full combat load, to fight at the top immediately after reaching the edge, and to keep climbing even when men fell beside them. The plan was straightforward on paper: approach the cliffs aboard UKW amphibious vehicles and British landing craft, fire rocket-launched ropes up the vertical walls, climb as fast as possible, overwhelm the defenders, and neutralize the guns. In reality, every part of the mission depended on timing, luck, and sheer will. Before dawn, a heavy swell battered the landing craft, throwing men into the steel sides and flooding the boats with icy water. The conditions slowed the approach enough to throw the entire operation off schedule. Worse, a navigational mistake pushed Rudder's first wave almost 3,000 yards off course. By the time the Rangers corrected their heading, German defenders were fully alerted. Smoke rose from barrage fire inland. Machine guns were already tracking the coastline. The window of surprise had closed. At 6:30, the first boats neared the base of the cliffs. The Germans opened fire instantly. Machine gun rounds tore across the water, snapping rope coils and punching into the wooden hulls. Mortar shells splashed around the craft, shattering men and equipment. Several landing craft were hit before they could even drop their ramps. Despite this, the Rangers leaped into the surf, fighting the undertow and the weight of soaked gear as they pushed toward the cliff base. Some boats had rocket launchers for firing grapnels, but seawater had soaked the powder charges. Many ropes misfired or fell short. Rangers grabbed whatever lines did reach the top and began climbing. The cliff face was coated in wet clay and crumbling stone. German defenders at the top leaned over the edge, firing down, cutting ropes, and dropping grenades that bounced and slid along the rock before detonating. Every explosion shook loose stones that rained down on climbers. Rangers used their knives, fingers, and boots to find cracks in the cliff, climbing with pure desperation. One grenade blast tore a Ranger's hand from the rope. He switched grip with the other and kept climbing until he reached the top, bleeding but alive. At roughly 7:08, the first Rangers crested the edge. They did not find a single intact gun pointing at them. Instead, they found trenches, machine gun emplacements, and a maze of bomb craters. The heavy Allied aerial bombardment the night before had shattered the concrete casemates, but strangely, the German guns themselves were missing. Nobody understood why. The most important artillery pieces in Normandy had vanished, but there was no time to question it. German infantry counterattacked immediately, rushing into trenches and firing MP-40 rifles and Kar-98 rifles at point-blank range. The Rangers split into small teams, clearing the trench lines with grenades and close-quarters fighting. The terrain was brutal. Cratered earth, collapsed bunkers, and shattered walls offered concealment for defenders and attackers alike. Every yard was contested. At the cliff edge, Rangers secured the perimeter so that reinforcements could climb behind them. Some held ropes steady, while others fired into the trenches to cover their advancing comrades.
Meanwhile, Colonel Rudder established a tiny command post on top of the point, no larger than a shallow ditch surrounded by fractured concrete. He attempted to radio the fleet offshore to report progress, but communication was nearly impossible. Static, interference, and German jamming cut transmissions short. Offshore commanders, hearing nothing from Rudder, feared the Rangers had been wiped out. Nevertheless, the Rangers pushed outward from the landing zone, following intelligence reports that suggested the guns might have been moved inland to protect them from bombardment. At around 9 o'clock, two Rangers, Sergeant Leonard Lomel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, moved down a dirt path that led through a hedgerow away from the destroyed casemates. There, hidden under camouflage netting beside a narrow farm road, they discovered the missing gun's 6 155mm artillery pieces intact and guarded, and positioned to fire directly onto Omaha Beach. Ammunition was stacked neatly beside them. Their discovery meant everything. If the guns opened fire, thousands of Americans on the beaches below could be slaughtered in minutes. Lomel immediately disabled the first gun using thermite grenades, melting critical gears inside the traversing and elevation mechanisms. He and Kuhn destroyed the second the same way, then returned with more grenades to disable the remaining ones. Within minutes, the primary German threat to the entire western flank of D-Day was eliminated, not by a massive assault, but by the Rangers acting alone in a hedgerow. Back at the cliff edge, German counterattacks intensified. Rudder's men were still vastly outnumbered, isolated, and low on ammunition. Machine gun nests placed deeper inland began firing on the Ranger positions from multiple angles. Snipers pinned down anyone attempting to resupply or move across open ground. The Rangers fought from crater to crater, holding a perimeter so fragile that any coordinated German assault could have pushed them back over the cliffs. But every Ranger knew the stakes. They had accomplished the objective no matter the cost. The guns were gone. Now they simply had to survive until reinforcements arrived. Rudder expected backup by mid-morning. It would take the rest of the day. By mid-morning on June 6th, the situation atop Pointe du Hoc had turned into one of the most desperate defensive fights in the entire Normandy invasion. Colonel Rudder and his 225 Rangers were still isolated, cut off from friendly forces, surrounded on three sides by German positions and under constant attack from infantry, snipers, mortars, and machine guns. Their only lifeline was the hope that the 5th Ranger Battalion, along with elements of the 29th Infantry Division, would break through from Omaha Beach and relieve them. But relief did not come. Not yet. Down on Omaha Beach, chaos reigned. The first waves of infantry had been shattered by heavy German fire. Landing craft were sunk or scattered, and units were pinned behind shingle embankments unable to move. The 5th Rangers, who were supposed to push inland and move toward Pointe du Hoc immediately after landing, were forced instead to help stabilize Omaha itself. Their famous response to the order "Rangers, lead the way" would become legend, but for the men at Pointe du Hoc it meant only one thing. They were now alone for far longer than expected. As German fire intensified, the Rangers transformed the cratered terrain into a defensive labyrinth. They moved through foxholes and bomb craters connected by shallow trenches carved on the spot. Ammunition dwindled quickly. Water was scarce. Medical supplies were nearly non-existent. Many wounded had to be dragged into craters and left with only basic bandages. While the fight raged around them, some bled quietly as their comrades fired over their heads. Others refused evacuation entirely, choosing instead to hold their rifles and continue fighting from the ground. German tactics shifted throughout the day. At first, they launched small probing attacks testing Ranger positions. These raids gradually evolved into coordinated thrusts from multiple directions. German infantry approached through ravines left and right of the point, attempting to infiltrate behind the defensive line. Snipers climbed into trees and shell craters to fire on exposed Rangers. At least a machine gun nest set deeper inland had perfect line of sight to the Ranger perimeter and poured fire relentlessly into any movement. Mortar rounds fell constantly, sending shards of metal through the already wounded wounded and carving new craters into the soft French soil. Rudder's command post was hit several times, the last blast collapsing parts of a crater wall and nearly burying the colonel alive. But he refused evacuation. He crawled out, brushed dirt from his map, and continued issuing orders with the same calm voice he had used during training exercises in England. Multiple radiomen were killed beside him, their equipment destroyed by shrapnel. When the primary radio was hit, Rangers scrounged parts from damaged sets to build a working transmitter under fire. Messages finally reached the fleet offshore. Mission accomplished. Guns destroyed. Need ammunition and reinforcements. On the cliffs below, the situation was equally precarious. German troops attempted several times to reach the rope lines and cut them permanently, which would prevent reinforcements from climbing up. Rangers left behind at the base of the cliffs engaged these attackers with rifles and grenades, fighting in waist-deep surf as waves crashed over them. At one point, a German soldier leaned over the cliff edge and used wire cutters to sever rope. A ranger shot him, but the line snapped and dropped several feet. Men climbing had to cling to the wet rock until another rope was thrown down. Throughout the morning and early afternoon, ranger teams continued searching for hidden German ammunition stores and additional artillery pieces. They found several underground bunkers and tunnels extending deep under the ruins of the casemates. In some of these tunnels, Germans ambushed rangers with grenades and bursts. Close quarters fighting in total darkness became common. Men firing pistols at gun flashes, using knives and rifle butts when weapons jammed in the mud. Many rangers later said the underground fighting was more terrifying than climbing the cliffs. By early afternoon, a new threat emerged. German artillery farther inland began targeting Pointe du Hoc. Shells crashed into the already devastated landscape, flattening craters and burying wounded alive. Ranger medics worked frantically to pull survivors from collapsing holes. Some men were killed not by shrapnel but by suffocation as crater walls gave way. Still, the Rangers held. Every time a German infantry attack threatened to break the perimeter, small ranger squads counterattacked with bayonets and grenades, shouting to create the illusion of larger numbers. Food ran out entirely by 3 p.m. Water supply was nearly exhausted. Ammunition was dangerously low. Rangers began collecting German rifles and ammunition from fallen soldiers. They used captured MG-34s to supplement their dwindling firepower. The battlefield had become a patchwork of American and German weapons scattered across burnt grass and shattered concrete. As the sun dipped lower, German commanders realized the Rangers were isolated and weakened. They assembled a larger force, survivors of the 914th Grenadier Regiment, supported by machine guns and mortar teams, and prepared a coordinated late-afternoon assault to retake Pointe du Hoc. If the attack succeeded, the Rangers would be driven off the cliff or killed where they stood. The Germans believed this final push would overwhelm the exhausted Americans. They advanced in tight groups, moving through ravines and hedges to strike the Ranger line from the southeast, where defenses were thinnest. The assault hit with devastating force. Rangers in the southeastern crater line were nearly overrun. Several positions fell. The Germans seized a section of trench and used it as a base to fire into the Ranger center. Colonel Rudder ordered all available men, including some wounded who could still stand, to plug the breach. What followed was one of the most brutal close combat fights of the day. Rangers and Germans clashing inside the same trench network, exchanging grenades over the same embankment, firing pistols at point-blank range. The fighting lasted nearly an hour before the Rangers finally repelled the assault. Bodies lay everywhere, scattered across trenches, craters, and the ravine pathway. By evening, the German command pulled back temporarily. They believed the Rangers could not survive another night without reinforcements. They were both right and wrong. The Rangers could barely hold, but they refused to retreat or surrender. Their mission was accomplished, but their survival depended entirely on reinforcements reaching them before another major attack. At dawn, once darkness fell, the entire battlefield changed character. German patrols crept close to Ranger positions, listening for movement. Rangers Rangers placed captured flares, mines, and tripwires along likely approach routes. Some men, too exhausted to stand, slept sitting upright with rifles across their knees. Others whispered reminders to stay awake. The night was filled with distant artillery, the groans of wounded men, and the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. Reinforcements were still nowhere in sight. As dawn approached on June 7th, the men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion were reaching the limits of human endurance. Many had been awake for almost 48 hours. Nearly half the original landing force was dead or wounded. Ammunition shortages were critical. Some riflemen counted their remaining rounds one by one in their pockets, aware that another German attack at first light could break through, simply because there would be no bullets left to fire. Colonel Rudder sent his final radio message before sunrise. Many wounded, low on ammunition, Germans counterattacking. Will hold. It was not a plea for evacuation. It was a declaration that as long as a single Ranger could still stand, Pointe du Hoc would not fall. German commanders, aware of the Rangers' worsening condition, prepared a renewed assault at dawn. Through binoculars, observers positioned inland watched the ruins atop Pointe du Hoc, noting collapsed trenches, smoldering craters, and the scattered silhouettes of American helmets barely visible behind rocks and destroyed concrete. They believed the Rangers would break with one more coordinated push. Patrols during the night had reported weak defensive firing and signs of extreme exhaustion. Mortar teams received orders to soften the Ranger positions with a heavy bombardment before infantry advanced to finish the job. At first light, German artillery opened fire once again. High explosive shells crashed into the already devastated landscape, blowing apart craters the Rangers had been using as cover, sending earth and debris over wounded men lying helpless in the open. Machine gun teams inland began sweeping the main plateau, forcing surviving Rangers to stay low to avoid being immediately cut down. Several bunkers that the Rangers had used as temporary medic shelters collapsed under direct hits. Men scrambled to pull injured comrades from rubble-filled entrances. Some could not be reached in time. Then the German infantry began moving forward. Dozens of troops advanced through tall grass and hedgerows south of the point, climbing toward the main ridge. Others moved through the ravine on the eastern side, attempting to flank the remaining Ranger defenses. Rangers responded with everything they had left: rifle bursts, a handful of grenades, captured German MP40s with half-empty magazines, even throwing rocks in one instance when ammunition fully ran out. The close-range fighting was savage, desperate, and chaotic. Rangers fought not to hold terrain, but simply to stay alive long enough for help to arrive. Colonel Rudder, despite being wounded, crawled from crater to crater, encouraging his men to keep firing. Several Rangers later recalled seeing him dragging himself across open ground, blood-staining his uniform, still shouting orders with a determination that seemed almost superhuman. At one point, Rudder took cover behind a small mound of earth with two radiomen. A mortar round exploded nearby, killing one and wounding the other. Rudder grabbed the remaining radio handset and transmitted directly to naval forces offshore. "If reinforcement does not arrive, we cannot hold out." Even then, his voice was steady. Meanwhile, far to the south, the 5th Ranger Battalion and elements of the 29th Infantry Division were finally pushing inland. From Omaha Beach, progress had been slow and costly. Minefields, hedgerows, hidden German positions, and confusion had delayed their advance. But by early morning on June 7th, these forces had broken through German defenses and were making their way toward Pointe du Hoc. They moved cautiously through fields and orchards, wary of ambushes. Every step forward was contested, and every farmhouse seemed to hide another German machine gun. The Rangers leading the column could hear distant explosions coming from Pointe du Hoc. To men like Captain Charles Parker, the sound was unmistakable. The Rangers on the cliff were still under heavy attack, and were still fighting. This realization pushed the relief column forward with renewed urgency. Exhausted men jogged between hedgerows, dropping to the ground only when German fire forced them to. Medics treated wounded where they fell, but the march continued. The mission was clear: reach the 2nd Rangers before they were overwhelmed. Back at Pointe du Hoc, the German assault intensified around 7:30 a.m. A group of approximately 60 German infantry managed to reach the southern edge of the Ranger perimeter. They advanced through thick grass and fired from behind shattered tree stumps and collapsed bunkers. Rangers counterattacked with a small team, using a captured MG-30 they had salvaged during the night. They set up the machine gun on a broken section of concrete and opened fire, sweeping the ravine and breaking the German momentum. This action likely prevented the line from collapsing entirely. Higher on the plateau, wounded Rangers who could still crawl brought ammunition belts to active firing positions. One man, Private First Class John Jack Kuhn, later recalled dragging himself through mud to deliver a German ammunition can to a crew firing from behind a blasted concrete wall. "We were outnumbered, outgunned, and half dead," he said after the war. But nobody was going to let the Germans take that ground, not after what we'd done to get up that cliff. Then, at last, a miracle, or something close to it. Around 8:30 a.m., a Ranger lookout position near the western cliff edge spotted movement beyond the hedgerows. At first, he believed it was another German attack forming, but as the figures emerged from morning mist, he recognized their helmets, their posture, their weapons. He recognized the Ranger's scroll on their sleeves. He shouted down the line, "Rangers coming! Rangers coming up the road!" It was the 5th Ranger Battalion. The relief column had arrived. German forces, realizing they were about to be caught between two American groups, one atop the cliff and one pushing in from the rear, pulled back rapidly. Mortar fire ceased. The last German infantry withdrew toward Vierville and the inland strongpoints, leaving behind dead and wounded. For the first time in 36 hours, silence, or something like silence, fell over Pointe du Hoc. The scene that greeted the 5th Rangers was almost indescribable. The ground was unrecognizable, transformed into a lunar landscape of overlapping craters. Smoke drifted from shattered bunkers. Bodies, American and German, lay scattered across the plateau. Many wounded Rangers waved weakly or lifted their helmets in greeting, unable to stand. Others, covered in blood and ash, simply nodded in exhausted relief. Colonel Max Schneider of the 5th Rangers met Colonel Rudder near what had once been a German casemate entrance. Rudder, pale and trembling, leaned onto Rangers to remain upright. He saluted Schneider. "Glad you made it," he said quietly. Those were his only words before collapsing from exhaustion and blood loss. Medics carried him to a makeshift aid station set up within one of the surviving bunkers. The cost of Pointe du Hoc became clear in the hours that followed. Of the 225 Rangers who had climbed the cliffs on D-Day morning, only around 90 were still able to fight. Nearly 70 were killed. Dozens more were wounded. Casualty rates exceeded 60%, among the highest of any unit that landed in Normandy. On June 6th, and yet, despite this terrible price, the mission had succeeded. The 6 155mm guns that threatened Utah and Omaha beaches were destroyed. Before they could fire a single shot, the German garrison atop Pointe du Hoc had been driven off or eliminated. The cliffs remained in American hands. The strategic impact was enormous. Had those guns remained operational, they could have devastated landing craft, support ships, and troops moving up Omaha Beach. Pointe du Hoc, though small in geographic terms, might very well have altered the course of D-Day had the Rangers failed to take it. Their success ensured that the American landings, though costly, were not rendered impossible by German artillery. But for the men who survived, the legacy of Pointe du Hoc extended far beyond strategy. It became a symbol of determination, sacrifice, and impossible courage. It embodied the Ranger motto, "Rangers lead the way," in its purest, most literal form. Years later, President Ronald Reagan would stand at Pointe du Hoc on the 40th anniversary of D-Day and address the surviving Rangers as the Boys of Pointe du Hoc, immortalizing their actions in one of the most famous speeches of the 20th century. Today, tourists walk among the craters that still scar the land. They touch the broken concrete of the casemates. They stare at the 100-foot cliffs and try to imagine climbing them with bullets cracking overhead, ropes cut by enemy fire, and comrades falling into the sea below. The landscape has changed little since 1944. It remains a place where bravery carved itself into the earth so deeply that even time cannot erase it. Pointe du Hoc stands not just as a battlefield, but as a monument to the Rangers who climbed where no one else could, who fought when no one thought survival was possible, who held the line until reinforcements arrived, who completed the mission against all odds, and who proved, once again, that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to climb the cliff anyway. What most people never realize about the assault on Pointe du Hoc is just how close the entire D-Day landings came to disaster. On every map in the Allied headquarters, Pointe du Hoc looked like a tiny dot on the Normandy coastline, insignificant compared to the vast beaches stretching east and west. But that dot hid 6 155mm guns that could have obliterated both Utah and Omaha Beach. American commanders understood the cold truth. If those guns fired even for 10 minutes, thousands of men could die before they ever reached the sand. The Rangers knew this as well. They had been told repeatedly that their mission was not simply important, it was essential. It was the key that could determine the success or failure of the largest amphibious operation in human history. And yet, many Rangers quietly believed they would not return. On the night before the assault, one Ranger officer wrote, "If half of us make it back, it will be a miracle." When dawn broke on June 6, the conditions were worse than anything expected. Waves 3 meters high slammed into the landing craft, throwing men against steel walls, washing equipment overboard, and scattering the assault waves. German artillery zeroed in on the approaching boats, sending shells so close that spray from exploding water covered the decks. A survivor later said, "We hadn't even reached the cliffs, and already it felt like the war was trying to drown us." But then came the climb, the moment that defined the Rangers. Grapnel hooks flew upward, ropes swayed in the wind, and men began scaling the vertical rock under machine gun fire, grenades, and falling stones. Every foot of progress was paid for in sweat, blood, and seconds of impossible courage. Some Rangers climbed with knives between their teeth, others with rifles slung behind them, but all climbed with the same determination: reach the top or die trying. When the first Rangers finally pulled themselves over the edge, they did not find a clear victory waiting for them. They found chaos, trenches twisting through the grass, bunkers hidden behind earthen walls, and German defenders emerging suddenly from the smoke. Small groups of Rangers fought on their own, maneuvering through the maze of fortifications without clear direction. They adapted, improvised, used enemy weapons when they ran low, and moved with the instinct of soldiers who understood that hesitation meant death. And then came the discovery that changed everything. The guns were gone. The objective that had defined their mission was missing. But instead of confusion, the Rangers reacted with the aggressive initiative that made them unique. They searched fields, hedgerows, and narrow farm paths until they located the massive 155mm guns hidden inland, pointed toward the beaches. With thermite grenades and rifle fire, they disabled the guns in minutes, preventing the massacre that Allied commanders had feared. It was the moment when a handful of exhausted, wounded, isolated Rangers ensured the survival of tens of thousands of soldiers landing below. It became one of the most remarkable accomplishments in modern military history, not because it was flawless, but because it succeeded against every possible odds imaginable.